Welcome, welcome, my viewers, to Real Faith Conversations with Michael Bidwell. I am joined by Pastor Wes Shealy. He's a minister of the Assemblies of God Church, and we're going to be breaking down for all of you at home today how it is to be a pastor, and we're also going to talk about his experience with Youth Alive for about 12 years. Correct?
Yeah,
Welcome, by the way.
yeah. Youth Alive for 12 years. I've been in ministry since '97. So yeah, been doing this for a while. But yeah, we'll get into just kind of what Youth Alive is and U.S. missions with the Assemblies of God and how unique it is. But yeah, thank you so much, Michael, for letting me be a part of this again.
Awesome. Yeah. Welcome back because you were great last time, so I thought, well, let's bring him back. So,
Oh, you're being too kind.
uh, so just briefly, can you talk about your just 12 years experience with Youth Alive and what you learned and what you took away from that experience?
Yeah, let me just explain just a little bit what Youth Alive is with this Assembly of God. Youth Alive was started with the whole premise of missionaries being sent to equip the local church and students within the local church to be missionaries on their public school campuses, middle school and high schools. Here in Oregon, we have a Youth Alive missionary that actually was doing this before Youth Alive was even created. So part of that was Youth Alive campus clubs, Bible clubs on middle school and high school campuses and so forth, teaching students how they can be an active missionary on their school campus. And so Youth Alive was created by the Assemblies of God, and it's unique in that that there is no other denomination that really focuses like this intently on the school campuses and having active missionaries, U.S. missionaries sent and equipped to do that kind of training. And so we started doing school assemblies here in Oregon called the Seven Project, and I just got hooked. And that's when God called my family, my wife and I, and at that time it was just my son that was born, and just called us to be the first state in the first Assemblies of God Network district to have two full-time Youth Alive missionaries. So we have Tom Bachman that's been around, and then Tom asked if I would be interested in joining him and overseeing campus clubs and our school assembly, the Seven Project. And so we joined. We started off as a missionary associate for the first year, and then we joined full-fledged Youth Alive missionary full-time, just like a foreign missionary. We were a U.S. missionary, and our focus was any kind of outreach on the school campus. So that was our campus clubs that was started and run by teenagers, and our school assemblies, Seven Project, as well as bringing in motivational speakers into different schools here in Oregon. And then eventually we branched into the Southern Idaho ministry network for the Assemblies of God. So it's all of Idaho except for the Panhandle. And just kind of branched in that for a handful of years. Yeah.
Sure. So you talked about two things. You talked about the school assemblies, and you talked about the clubs. Can you break down what those would look like on a day-to-day basis?
Yeah, so let's start with the campus clubs. When a student would come to me and ask for advice, hey, I want to start a Christian club on my school campus. The first thing I would ask them is, what kind of club are you wanting to start? Because that would determine, I think a lot of times students look at their numbers as a sometimes discouraging. And sometimes the heart behind a student that wants to start the campus club was a prayer group, just wanted to pray for the school campus. That's kind of like the see at the pole that happens about once a year in October. Sometimes the students were like, I just want to pray for my school campus. A group of us just want to either walk around the school campus for school, or gather once a week around the flagpole, or walk the hallways during lunchtime and just pray throughout the school. And so I would walk them through, what does that look like? Sometimes they were like, we just want to do a Bible study. And so it kind of helped the student organize and what does that look like as far as a Bible study, and understand that the size of the club may look different depending on what their focus is. And then some would say, no, I want to reach the unsaved. And so I would actually, in my opinion, I would encourage them to not make it look like their youth group. Because a lot of times the students will look at what their youth pastor is doing because they love their youth ministry. And they would want to copy that on the school campus. And I would just kind of point out, like, the kids that you want to reach on your school campus aren't coming to your youth group anyways. So don't copy what your youth pastor is doing. Think outside the box. What is it that would reach your school? And so one of the things that I did as a youth pastor in Klamath Falls, once a month, we would do ask a question about Jesus, get a slice of pizza. So we would provide, as a youth pastor, pizza once a month, and kids would just flood into a classroom, and they could ask any kind of questions they want. So we had atheists, we had, we just pack it out. Part of it is they wanted pizza, but it just started a dialogue and relationship. And so that was kind of the key behind that. So it was just helping students. What's the proper steps? Sometimes the school would say you can't have a Christian club, which what a lot of people don't know is that the United States has what's called the Student Bill of Rights. And it was created that every student on a school campus has the right to have, like, students have the right to pray on campus. They have the right to carry their Bibles, and they have the same equal rights to have a Christian club on the school campus. They just may have to go through the same process of all the other clubs, like Key Club and that kind of stuff. So sometimes was having to walk a student through, what does that look like? Is this one that you want to fight? Sometimes with the school administration, or if it was just doing a prayer or a Bible study, they could do that out on the yard. They could do that in the cafeteria, and nobody can stop. As long as they're not disrupting a class or like an assembly or anything like that, and just doing it respectful. So we saw a great success in that, in campus clubs. And in fact, I mean, right now, today here in Oregon, campus clubs are taking off again. And we're seeing them pop up all over the state, and which is pretty cool. And so with the school assemblies, it was character education. So a lot of people asked, how can you do a school assembly on a school campus? And we just focus on character education, just like any other school assembly. With the 7 project, we let the principal pick the different topics. So the reason why it was called 7, they picked up to 7 different topics that we would present. And we would train local people to be the presenters, because our desire was that we wanted the 7 projects to come into a school or into a community, but never leave. And the only way that could happen is by raising up local people to be the face of that school assembly. And so a lot of times it was people sharing their stories, a quick snippet of their story. We would weave themes through it. So like one community, our whole theme that we would weave through a 45-minute school assembly was your choices today affect your tomorrow. Or We even use bad company corrupts good character, which is in Corinthians. So we actually had students in a public school quote scripture without them ever realizing they were quoting scripture, which was pretty cool, And so if you think about character education, that public schools teach, they're biblical based. And so our school assemblies, even though we didn't mention Jesus, we definitely presented Jesus and had opportunities to connect with students, get them sometimes the help that they needed. And in some cases, we were able to do night rallies and be able to present the gospel. Or we came back into the communities maybe a week or 2 or 3 weeks later, and we're able to do a youth rally at a church where friends could invite their friends, and we were able to present the gospel.
Because I remember, I don't know if you were ever at the particular assemblies I was at in middle school, but I do remember people coming in, even though I didn't know the systems and the name of them. And I do remember one or two night rallies at the local middle school up here
So in Pendleton, yes, that is, Michael, that is how I built a relationship with Pendleton. And that actually opened up doors for us, at the middle school, at the high school. It opened up doors for us to be able to introduce new youth pastors that came into Pendleton to the school administration. But we also started producing the high school graduation, and we did that for 17 or 18 years in a row. But it all started with the school assembly.
Yeah, that's so cool, so cool. So you did Youth of Life for 12 years, and then you told me that you were also a youth pastor for several years. I'd like to move into that for a little bit, for quite some time. What is your what is your opinion of the biggest struggles for youth today?
Today, we are in a, like youth ministries today, it has to look different. Ministry today just looks different, but you have a generation that is in a fast-paced world, and a lot of it is because of, this technology right here. Things have to change rapidly. And so the things that I used to do early off in youth ministries probably wouldn't necessarily work today. But we have a generation, and we live in a culture that is just looking for truth. And so I would say our teenagers today are hungry for that. But I think the biggest struggle is how busy our culture is here in America. And speaking as a parent, even as parents, we're I think have to be held responsible for keeping our kids busy, because they're playing 2 sports at a time. If they're doing one sport in school, they may be doing a club sport on weekends. And so what I've seen and I've heard from youth pastors today is trying to figure out what works for them, their church and the church's schedule, as well as the local community of when does a youth group meet. And then what does it look like? So whether if it's more of a Bible study type based small groups versus a service, that kind of thing. So I would say just how busy it is and what the structure of the youth ministry looks like. I think it just has to look different of what fits the local church and the local community on what works. Yeah, and it's we have a generation that's just glued to videos, so they're watching everything on their phone. They're just not watching a lot of stuff about Jesus. But I would say this, we have a generation, when God gets a hold of them, a generation that is passionate about reaching their friends and making a difference.
I think that's very good. So you talked a little bit about the struggles of youth and youth ministry in general. But how would you kind of in a meeting setting uh that like uh facilitate not facilitate but how would you minister to somebody that's like you said, always glued to their phone, always got so many different distractions, like from movies or TV or the culture at large? You
Yeah, how would we minister? I don't think teenagers are any different than what pastors have to face within their churches today. So we used to have to tell kids to put their phones away. Well, now most people use their phones for their Bible, right? So churches in general have figured out how do we use our phones and technology to and be interactive in our messages or our services. So I mean, we type through our phone, QR codes. We have visitors scan to fill out visitor forms with QR codes. I've been part of youth conferences where we do surveys, questions, and then live polling on the screens where kids could text their answers. So you just have to be creative today. How do we use technology, which we have a generation. I think they're born knowing how to how to use different apps. It's crazy. I don't think we utilize our teenagers well enough in what they're already just. It's common sense to them of how to use the different social media stuff on, I don't know, maybe creating testimony videos or how to brand and get the word out of what they're doing within their youth group and ministry. So um, maybe a lot of it is kind of how do we use the technology and so forth, um, and release students that are gifted in it and talented in it, and release them to actually use those gifting and talents and realize they could use it to further their God's kingdom than maybe their own popularity.
So how would you handle, as a youth pastor, because you were a youth pastor in California, how would you handle group dynamics? Like I'm assuming it was a Wednesday night because that's many youth meetings, how it's structured. How would you handle the group dynamics, relationships, drama? Break that down.
A lot of patience. Yeah. I mean, it's, uh, sometimes it was, for me, and I mentioned it before when we were on with my wife and I were on with you. Like my parents, they just had this open door policy mentality, and they're really shaped in who I am. And so a lot of when I would step into a youth ministry or even into a ministry, it was, I don't care who you are or what your background is or how you're living even now. God created you and I need to get to know you. And so, I mean, we're talking what, over 20 years ago in our youth ministry here in Oregon. I mean, we had at one point around 15 students that were either uh, in the closet or out of the closet, living the LGBTQ lifestyle. And that was way before the time of actively reaching students like that. And a lot of it was they came to a place where they felt like they could be themselves. They knew exactly what we believed in. We didn't condone the sin, but what we did is love the people. And but it took a while for us to create that culture within the ministry and within the church to just love people. We love people because Jesus loved them. And by creating that culture, it created an atmosphere where students felt safe. And I think that's why in a small community, we had 150 plus students in our youth ministry. And it's doesn't mean all of them serve the Lord. Doesn't mean that all of them are still serving the Lord, but some of the seeds were planted. And so it's one of those, how did we deal with the different dramas? I mean, there were some nights when we had 150 students in our youth ministry that I was like, tonight was pointless. I'm not even sure if Jesus was even here tonight because of all the distractions, all of the drama, the fights, and all that stuff. And so it taught me how to protect the environment and what God has in the ministry itself. And so in those moments, it just taught me, like, never had the heart to kick a student out of our youth ministry because everyone was welcome. But I learned real fast that I may have to ask a student to leave and not come back until I have a meeting with them and we have some steps and process in order to protect the environment and the other students that needed to hear the message that. And so there was times that we just had to love. I mean, we loved, we had patience, but yet we also loved with some with boundaries.
Yeah. I love that. I love that. So how would you handle with that? When you talk about love, you talk about loving the people that are hard to love. How would you deal with a student that was came to you, let's say, who had a bad home life or a bad situation or a bad abusive home, or how did you handle that kind of situation? And what would you advise new youth pastors to do in that sort of situation?
Yeah, I mean, there's extremes in that. So, I mean, we had students that were couch kids, so because of home life and parents not necessarily care where their kids were, they would bounce from friend's house to friend's house and just live on the couches. So they're considered couch kids. We had some of those students in our ministry. And we also had students that were abused. Now, in our position, we are mandatory reporters. So when we had situations that we felt like the child is unsafe, and when we had proof that there was physical abuse taking place, we had to report it, and walk a student through those situations. And sometimes it was tough, because sometimes in loving them and making sure that they're safe, we became the enemy because we forced them being removed from a home. So sometimes it caused some mixed, I would say, thoughts in a confused teenager. But a lot of it was our house was their house, and we had students that looked at us as their parents, even though they didn't live with us. We just felt like, and my wife and I, we could love whether they had good homes or came from broken homes, that we'll love them all the same. And we didn't treat a kid in a good home or a church family any different than a kid that came in on our bus ministry or was bouncing from couch to couch, and they just knew that we loved them and loved them unconditionally.
Yeah. Uh, we, yeah, I love it. And, let's go back into kind of a ministry aspect for a second. Let's say, you go, you, because we've all of us that have grown up in the Christian culture go to these conferences, whether it's like the Ramp in Hamilton, Alabama, or it's a Passion conference. I've never really went to a youth conference inside the Ramp, but they do exist. So how would you sustain that fire, that vigor, that gained of a youth camp or youth conference that can last throughout the week? That's not just that doesn't just peter out within the first 2 weeks of the students returning to the church and to their classes.
Yeah, I mean, I think definitely. I don't think there's a creative way of having it die out. I mean, I think we all get when we go to conferences, we get energized and we get excited, and then we go back home and we start living our day to day. And sometimes, and honestly, most of the time, we face some tough times right after a conference, and God does something in our life. It's no difference with teenagers, whether they go to camp or a youth conference. One of the things that I always strive to do, what I strive to do as a youth pastor was keep our, no matter, even if we're at a conference, we still had our moments within our youth ministry. So after a service, I would meet with my students and we would have a circle up where everybody would share something that they liked about the service, and then as the conference went on, every time that we had a circle up, I would ask them a more in-depth type question. What is one thing that God is speaking to you? And then what I started to do was, on our way home, we would stop at one last rest stop before we pulled into town, and we would do it one more time. And I would just talk to them like, here's what we will want to do is tell our friends that they missed out, but we need to encourage them that what God has spoken to us and has done for us, we are actually going to continue to live it out, and so they could be a part of it. And the other side was letting them know that some of them are going to be attacked and hit with some hard times because of what God has done in their life over the weekend or the week with camp. And so just preparing them, and have them restate the one thing that has really impacted them on that conference or that trip, and hold on to it and let them know, like, every single one of us, we need to hold each other accountable and pray for each other for the next few weeks. And we would try to build on top of it, not let it be a standalone.
Sure.
So we would merge our ministry into the conference, even though it was separate, or the camp, even though it was separate. But when we went back home, we would try and build on top of what God did that weekend or that week.
So, to follow up on that, how would you prompt your kids after the conference is done to go ahead and preach the gospel to their classmates and possibly even to their parents or siblings? How would you continue prompting them to live that out, what they were taught at the conference?
Yeah, I think in my opinion, I think where we as pastors, we generalize things way too much. When God has created us with unique giftings and callings, um, and so I wouldn't generalize this is what we are doing as a group, but yet I would encourage, like, the generalization of we need to reach our friends, we need to win the lost. Some of your mission field is not just your school campus, but your mission field is your home. For some teenagers, they're the only believer in the home, which means they're the spiritual leader of their home. And so, but that's where the relationship from my wife and I to the students, but also our youth leaders, and empowering our youth leaders and our volunteers to be the spiritual leaders for the students as well. Because it's okay. It was okay for me that I had students that felt more comfortable going to some of my youth leaders for spiritual help, prayer, because I couldn't do it. I couldn't do it and be successful. It was equipping my leaders to release them to also be spiritual leaders within the ministry itself. Because here's the reality: pastors come and go. Youth leaders and volunteers in the church, if that's their church and they make it their church, they're going to stick around. And so, I still have youth leaders in Klamath Falls. They're not youth leaders anymore, but yet they're still connected because their kids were in youth at that time. They're still connected with students that were part of our ministry that are grown adults with their own families now. And I'm not. And so, that's the importance of having strong leadership within the local church.
Yep. I agree. You talked a lot about loving people and loving kids. So how do you walk the line between being a leader, being a pastor, being a teacher, and being a friend?
Yeah, that's a great question. And there you'll learn, and I would say I still am learning that what is that line. It's early on I learned, because I wanted to be friends. I mean, starting off in youth ministry, I wasn't too much older than the high schoolers, so I wanted every teenager to like me. I wanted to be their friend and to be the cool youth pastor. And then I realized there has to be a moment where it's more than just being a friend or a big brother, but I needed to be the adult. Even if they had parents, sometimes I was the adults in their life. And I think that kind of goes back to the individual. What is that person needing in their life, per se? But there is a fine line for pastors of what that friendship. Michael, you and I are friends. But there are certain things, because of the spiritual leadership that I hold, that I cannot divulge with you as a friend. And that's to protect you, but it's also to protect the other people, and knowing that they could come to me and know that I'm not just going to my friends and sharing some of the things that maybe is weighing heavy on me because of what a counseling session that I just sat in with, those kind of things. So, and I have to be careful with my opinions on elections, right? It's I have opinions. My opinions, big example was COVID. I had opinions about COVID, but we also had people in a church that, majority of them didn't care for a lot of the restrictions and so forth. But we also had others that did care, and we had a community, the ones that were upset with the faith base. I mean, honestly, those are the ones that we're supposed to be reaching to. So there's a line in there of how to navigate stuff, but still be bold enough to speak truth when we need to speak truth.
Excellent. So how would you handle tough questions? Because we know teenagers, they have, especially if they come outside of the church, they have a lot of questions. So how would you handle the tough questions on spiritual matters?
Yeah. Well, the first one, a lot of times tough questions, I may not have the answer right away. So it's okay. It's okay for pastors. At least I feel it's okay for me to say, you know what? That is a great question. How about if we study that together? Because I don't have an answer for you right now. And sometimes I would just say, if you give me a week, I will dig into this and I will find some answers for you. And sometimes, there is no answers. Kids asking, why are my parents getting a divorce? Or why did my dad walk out? Or, why am I depressed and dealing with suicidal thoughts? Why am I struggling with homosexuality? Why am I attracted to the same sex? I mean, those are some of those tough questions that I think for a lot of times churches just over spiritualized it and said, well, the enemy is attacking you. Well,
That's not an answer.
it's not, it's an answer and that's part of it. But what does scripture say about it? And walk is a journey. And that's the one thing that I have always, I'm the kind of person, and you know this, even as an adult and speaking to adults in a Sunday service, I always say that we're on a faith journey, and I'm still on a faith journey. As I'm walking here on this earth, I'm still growing in my faith, and I'm still learning, and I'm still learning who God wants me to be, and I want to grow in that. And I tell teenagers that when I was a youth pastor, and I'd say, I want to bring as many people on this journey with me as possible and grow together. And so I had no problem at tough questions, telling students, you know what, let's explore this together. Let's go on this journey together. And let's talk this out.
Okay, so we kind of answered this question kind of earlier on, but I want to go a little deeper into it.
Yeah.
How would you handle different personality types? Like, let's say Susie is an introvert and doesn't want to do like a certain activity, or maybe John is an extrovert and wants to always be the one to pray, or they always want to sit by that crush that they have, and that causes an issue. So would you mind breaking that down?
Yeah. Some of that is creating that atmosphere where the introverts also feel safe to be an extrovert. It's but it's also providing that opportunity for time. Like we would do weekend encounters with our youth ministry and a lot of journaling and so forth. And we would take time. We wouldn't force students to share. Or when I would do my circle ups, I wouldn't necessarily force students to share, but I would wait a long, uncomfortable time with silence, and it would never fail that it took a while, but sometimes students just needed that extra long time of the Holy Spirit really tugging at their heart to finally speak up and say, this is what God is speaking to me, or I would like to read what I wrote down. And so it's providing that time for the introverts to be comfortable enough to share or participate. But here's the beautiful thing is finding leaders that aren't like me. Because I would have leaders that were introverts as well and could relate to the student that was standing off to the side that didn't want to play the icebreaker or the game. And it was also creating our extrovert students and some of my leaders, teenage leaders, and saying, hey, can you help bring some of those introverts, the ones that are standing on the side of the wall, and get them to participate? Don't force them, but encourage them. Be the friend, because you may not hang out together at school. You may be in different social groups, but this is family. And we're all family here. So let's include everyone.
I love that. I love that. So, how big was your youth group in
Yeah.
general?
So our youth ministry in Southern Cal, it was, we started off with and maybe about 15, 20. And we walked into a interesting situation where the youth pastors before us started a church literally right next door to our church. And so we would have students that were kind of bouncing between their old youth pastor, who's now a pastor of a church. They would go to that church and then come to our youth group because that's what they knew. So it was a weird dynamic, but we got really involved in the local high school and middle school, and we grew that within 2 years. We were only there for 2.5 years, a lot shorter than what we really wanted to. But we grew that at 60 to 70 kids. And then we ended up in Klamath Falls, Oregon. And that started off with handful, literally like 5 or 6 kids, church kids. And we had an incredible board member that started a bus ministry for us. And Ernie would bus in, and he ended up busing in 60 to 70 kids. And so we real fast, we grew our youth ministry, which met on Tuesday nights. We grew that to 150 kids. And that's where we learned we had to restructure it because it just wasn't, I wasn't protecting at that time. I wasn't protecting the environment and what God really wanted to do. And so a healthy size for us. By the time we left, we were 60, 70 kids on a Tuesday night. Our discipleship night was Wednesday nights, and we probably had 30 or 40. And on Sunday mornings, attending the church service, adult service, we probably had about 25 to 30 kids as well. Where when we first got there, it was about five students.
So, you're telling me that you know how to you know how to grow a church, or you know how to grow a youth program. So what would you say to a leader that's struggling to find, struggling with a smaller youth group, or maybe not a youth group that's very interested in being a youth group? They just do it just because they want to do it, or just because they were told to do it.
Yeah, it's I don't know. For me, when I was a teenager, I went through 4 youth pastors. And every single one of those youth pastors I learned incredible things from. We had one that was not, I would say it was a bad experience. But I still learned some things from that youth pastor. And I think that really shaped me to the desire to reach students, because I knew how much my youth ministry for me growing up, that was my life. That was, if it wasn't school and if I wasn't working, I was at church, and realizing how much that really protected me from a lot of stupid decisions that the world had to offer me. And when God called me to be in ministry, it was always, from being in kids' church to middle school camp to missions trips when I was in high school, and a convention where God reminded the call on my life. Just realized how important that was for me, but also the struggles that I had as a teenager. And the people that really helped me make it through some tough, difficult times. And it was always connected to a youth group. And it was more than just, I had youth pastors that didn't treat it as we're just doing it because we need to do it. It was, I felt like they generally cared for me as an individual. Now, my wife grew up in church, and she didn't have a youth pastor. She didn't understand. And she even, when we talked, when we were dating and we knew that we were going to get married, she's like, I don't know if I'm a youth pastor's wife. And I said, well, and we had the conversations for her to be the youth pastor's wife that she always wanted to, like, as far as when she was a teenage girl, that she wanted a youth pastor's wife to pour into her life. But honestly, if you love God and love others, follow scripture, it's easy for teenagers to be attracted to that kind of ministry. So all the other stuff are just tools, it's bells and whistles. But if you love God and love others, you have a generation that is hungry just to understand what true love is. But that's the key, Michael, is it has to be true and it has to be honest. It can't be a program. Churches are good with programs, but it has to be the relationship.
I like that, the relationship. Let's kind of move into a different kind of subject, because you were my associate pastor for what, three years?
Yeah, I was in Pendleton for 4 years, so I think you came about a year.
2019. So I think we literally came around the same time.
Not too long after we moved there.
Yeah. So what was your job? What did Pastor Phil want you to do when he hired you?
So when we moved to Pendleton, our church at the time was, man, we were 450 plus. The church was packed, and we were trying to figure out, Pastor Phil was trying to figure out possibly having to do a building program, 2 services, that kind of thing. He wanted to avoid the 2 services. And so my position was created for him to prepare for retirement when he turned, I won't mention the age.
Yeah, because he'll probably watch at some point. So, probably a good idea.
Right. My job was, he felt like his plate, if you look at the ministry plate and everything that's in a lead pastor's portfolio and on his plate, he didn't want to lead everything from the middle of the plate and everything there. He wanted to lead from out front. And he just felt like where the church was and how the size it was for it to get to that next step, he needed to hand everything off of his plate so he could lead out front. So my position was created to do just that. And I don't know this for sure, but I think a lot of it was to prepare for either a building remodel or something, because we were at the place that we needed to figure something out with the facilities to continue to grow.
Yeah.
But then COVID happened.
Right.
And all of a sudden we didn't have people in the church. And so then it was trying to navigate, what does it look like? What does church even look like now? And so there was a lot of uncertainty for every church, every ministry, even businesses, schools, the world was uncertain. How do we navigate through it? And everybody had their opinions, but nobody really knew what's the best way of handling it. So, and then when we reopened, we had the 2 services. CR, or Celebrate Recovery, moved from Thursday nights to Sunday nights, and that replaced our Sunday night service. And Celebrate Recovery exploded, from 40, 50 people to 130 people of all ages. So we're reaching families at that point. Wednesday nights turned into family nights. So we had something for every age group. So a lot of great things came from, but as far as the growth, I think when we left, we were about 350 just we were about 300 and growing, and you just felt the momentum kind of start kicking up again, and that's kind of where we were at when we left. Hamilton, and after Pastor Phil retired. But our responsibility was to take things off Pastor Phil's plate so he could lead the church from out front into that next phase, whatever that was going to look like.
Okay. So you talked about COVID. Could you kind of break down, because that was a tumultuous time for all of us. Could you kind of break down the meetings, the decisions, how it all kind of shook out for that year and a half?
Yeah, luckily our church was already doing a live feed inside the building. We weren't doing it live stream. And so we were doing a live feed. We already had the cameras and stuff like that. And luckily we had a missionary friend of ours that is just very talented with technology that was in town. And when all of a sudden we were shut down. And so it didn't take long. It didn't take long for us to convert what we had to go live. And so we actually did not miss a Sunday. We went from having people in church to being shut down and just live streaming on a Sunday morning to people in the homes, where some churches had a couple weeks of not knowing what to do or having to meet in the church parking lot and doing stuff in the church parking lot. We did things right away, live stream. So, but it took, I think that first week of being completely locked down, I think I probably spent a good 70 hours at the church that week just to figure things out. And probably that first month of COVID, probably worked about 2 months worth of hours, just making sure live stream was dialed in and so forth. Our media person was in lockdown for those 2 or 3 weeks of the first 2 or 3 weeks of COVID because of exposure and not sure. They were fine, but once again, we just weren't sure. So our meetings though was, what is our government saying? What is our state saying? What's the policy? What can we do? What can't we do? Talking to lawyers, what's the legal rights? What's the punishment if we ignore it? And then it was also, as leadership, who are we trying to reach? And yes, we have our church people that we need to continue to minister to, but the long term, we have people who don't know Jesus, don't live with the hope and the faith that we live by and walk by, and we still need to be able to minister to them when this is all said and done. So a lot of meetings, having to do research of what is the laws, what's the regulations, mandates, all that stuff. And there was some frustrations, not towards each other as far as staff, but some our own frustration counseling sessions and staff meetings, because we just couldn't express our own opinions to everybody else, but yet we could in our own staff meeting, and so we just wanted to make sure that we were doing things right. It was something that spiritual leaders never had to face before, a world pandemic, like
At least for a long time.
for a long time, and a world pandemic with the population, and so you think about how intense our population is today and how we're able to travel versus the last time there was a world pandemic. It was just different, and so, and we were just coming off of having the flood in Pendleton.
I remember.
We went from Samaritan's Purse being hosted at our church for 6 weeks to being completely shut down. So we went from a flood that we were recovering from to now we have a pandemic that we're living through. And so it just was, that year was busy.
So, so you talked about COVID. So how did you handle the day to day of COVID? Well, not just COVID, just the day to day like disagreements of the laity from the carpet to the temperature. Literally, you mentioned this to me like once before, where somebody came to you and asked you about the temperature. How do you handle like from the serious like COVID, the legitimate concern of COVID, to something as mundane and kind of petty as the temperature of the
The
building?
temperature of the church, or how loud or how soft the sound is, those kind of things. Everybody has their opinion, and they're going to voice their opinion. Sometimes it's okay. I can see what I can do, but I doesn't mean that things will change. And when it comes to the temperature, a lot of times what people they complain about how cold the church is, but if it's too hot, people fall asleep. So there's a purpose of keeping a room a little cooler. Like if you come into a church and you're too cold, you could put a jacket on, bring a blanket. That's okay. But if it's too hot in a room, people will fall asleep, no matter how exciting the speaker is. So volume, there's reasons for it. People have their opinions. They're going to voice their opinions. And sometimes it's, okay, I hear you, and I'm sorry you feel that way. But, if they want to, major on some of the minors, um, you know, that's where some people just live in that kind of life. The little things are the things that just disrupt their whole day. So I guess for me the prayer is that eventually they see that there's the church isn't just for them, it's for everyone. And so what's that happy medium? Let's go back to youth ministries. We could either do things that are like kids church for the sixth graders, or we could do things that are more college like for the juniors and seniors, or we kind of focus on a medium age group that's in that eighth grade freshman level. So some things are immature for the juniors and seniors, and some things are going to be over the head of the sixth and seventh grade. But that happy medium, you kind of focus in that so that you could reach the whole demographic, and so that's from worship music, why we do new songs, and why it's important to still do some of the old songs, to how loud it is, to the temperature. um Believe it or not, pastors don't take the small things lightly. There's an answer to the why behind those things.
So, with COVID, how did you handle because I know our church was kind of split between people that were pro-mask and anti-mask. How did because you shared with me, like, because we were in Pendleton for studies and I was a more intimate group, so I knew a little bit more what the average person went, a little bit more than the average person. So how did you handle those disagreements, and how did you walk that line of trying to preach the gospel but assuage people's concerns or take a stand when you had to?
Yeah, we try to find a way of. I mean, you're not going to find that happy medium where everybody's going to be happy, but we also understood, hey, if you don't feel safe in our building and how we have structured it to be as safe as possible, um, but yet still being able to move, like some of the regulations, having to enter into one way and walk down. I mean, they wanted us to walk down one aisle into the building and then turn around and walk out the other aisle out those doors. But yeah, you're on the lobby all together. Some of the policies were just so didn't make sense, but we found what is going to work for us, and we're going to be okay with it. And if we get pushback from either people in the church, or because we had people that pushed back when we said, hey, can you at least wear a mask to your seat? Because that was when they were able to open up and let people in. Uh, we said, we spaced the chairs, and we had our aisles and so forth. And we provided masks, we provided hand sanitizer, that kind of stuff. And we said, just for those that are, because we had people with cancer and so forth, just because of people in our church with some health compromise, would you please wear your mask to your seat? And once you're at your seat, you can remove your mask, because that is your place. And and we said to people who weren't comfortable even with that, that's why we have live stream. And we also provided a separate room for people who just wanted to be away from a mass group of people. So they could still be on site, but they could be in a separate room on their own. So we had different locations to start off with, now that I'm thinking about it, from the coffee shop to the prayer room to the sanctuary. We had different areas that people could kind of gather at and attend church in a smaller group if that's what they preferred, or they could stay home.
So here's a little bit of a tough question, because I know we kind of went through this one a little bit with one of the leaders that had a moral defect, a moral character defect.
Mm-hmm.
Or you don't know that I know, but I asked around and I know. But how do you deal with that sort of situation, and how much do you share it with the congregation, and how much do you not?
So what I appreciate with this Assemblies of God is, and we've learned through the years, because if you go back to the 80s, Swaggart and Baker were Assemblies of God ministers, and they were well known pastors with PTL and that kind of thing in the 80s, nationwide in spiritual leadership. And the Assemblies of God has learned how to navigate pastors with moral failure or just character issues. And so we do have within the Assemblies of God a restoration process. It is a two-year process in cases. Every case is different, but it's also up to the minister if they want that restoration. Every case, I would say, is different, because every choice and every case is different and what's been done. It's kind of hard to answer that one, Michael, just because of depending on what the situation is. Our situation in Pendleton was just is a weird situation, as we were in a pastoral search, and leadership was kind of up in the air of between the board and me as an interim, and so it was just a bad situation, bad timing, and it's a sad thing. I would say most of the time pastors that end up in a situation usually starts off with something that is off within their own spiritual walk, and that's that self-care. That's the accountability that's around. That's not addressing maybe hurts that they've gone through, or maybe burnout, and asking for help, and they're finding they allowed the enemy a foothold into their heart and into their spiritual walk. And what better way to destroy people that's under their ministry or a church than for the spiritual leader to have failure? And we're seeing this with prominent leaders even today, so a lot of big name pastors that have come out all of a sudden of some horrible situations from years ago to recently, and now their churches are having to navigate where was God in all this, and so Um, what I do appreciate with the Assemblies of God is the help that is always extended to their pastors. And through the restoration process doesn't mean that they necessarily will be actively involved in ministry. And sometimes they aren't offered the restoration process because of that act or the situation. Let's put it that way.
So how would you talk about the order of worship? Um, because there's a lot of debate around that. Should we do that? Like you mentioned it before, should we do the hymns? Should we do the modern music? Should be a mixture of both? Where does the sermon come in? How long should the worship set be? And it's all really based, at least within the evangelical culture, it's all based within the individual leadership of each church. With the more traditional denominations, it's more set. But so how do you make those decisions?
You got to know your people, right? So what's the demographic, but also where as a spiritual leader what's the demographic that you're wanting to reach? Let's say you're, as a pastor, you have a church that is 60 plus in age. Well, your worship is probably very traditional per se. You're probably not doing a lot of newer songs. But let's say you as a church leadership, you've been talking about wanting to reach younger families. You have to slowly navigate that as how do we reach younger families? And so you have to adjust where you are still meeting the needs of the people that's in your church and not changing the DNA of the people of why they call it their church, but yet being able to shift and navigate to where younger families are going to say, "Oh my word, this church is appealing," and song choice is part of that. The length of worship is part of that. The length of your service is part of that. Doesn't mean that you have to always stick with our church only meets for an hour and 15. And we only preach for 25 minutes and we only have 30 minutes of worship, those kind of things. You're still, at least for me, I'm the kind of pastor that I want that freedom, the flexibility, but yet, there's a demographic of definitely young families that need to be reached. And go back to youth ministries. Teenagers are a part of your church. It's no longer that we should be looking at teenagers as the future church, because if teenagers don't see their church as their church, there is no future church. So, the Oregon Ministry Network for the Assemblies of God, their youth department, youth and kids, they call it the Gen Now, not the next gen, but it's the Gen Now ministry, because it's the now generation. And they're gifted and talented enough to be leading worship on a Sunday morning, or be on the worship team, or running the media, or being a greeter at the door, those kind of things. There are some that are gifted enough to preach on a Sunday morning in some of our churches, and inspire our 60, 70-year-olds, and so, just having to navigate that. I just don't think that you rip the Band-Aid off. Yeah, you have to go in and do it very carefully and navigate that and test the waters sometimes.
So we're going to kind of move into the church politics a little bit, but also vision casting for the church in general.
Yeah.
So how do you, because for those that don't know, the Assemblies of God, which I am no longer a part of, but I was for a good, few years, we have a church system where they usually, not always, but usually have a board that is technically in charge of the church, even though the pastor's kind of head of it. So how do those dynamics work with the church board, and how does the pastor navigate his vision, but also try to sway the concerns of the board and work with the politics, and how to vote on a certain issue, how to not vote on a certain issue?
Yeah, and that's, every denomination is a little bit different. You have some denominations that the churches are board run, and then the pastor works for the board. The way the Assemblies of God is structured, so I'll speak on the Assemblies of God behalf. We have two different kinds of churches. We have a general council church, which we consider as a sovereign church. That's what Pendleton First is a general council church. So it has a board, and every church is different in the general council church according to the bylaws. So how many board members, or there's board members and trustees. So board members can vote, trustees just give advice, that kind of thing, or maybe fall under the spiritual side and accountability for the pastor. But the pastor is the chair of the board in the Assemblies of God. So when a lead pastor comes in, they're the chair of the board, and they run and function what the board is presented with. So the board, per se, with the Assemblies of God, handles the everyday function. So let's say facilities, or wanting to change some of the bylaws, they'll look at some of the bylaws to be able to present to the membership of the church to vote on. It will be the financials they're responsible for. So what are we spending money on? If the carpet needs to be redone, so maybe some of the board members would go out and figure out what companies and bids and so forth, and whether we even do that. So it's the accountability of the board it's kind of the accountability of the pastor, and making sure the pastor isn't just out there doing whatever they want to do. If the teaching of the board, the structure of the board is done right. Now, we also have what's called district affiliated churches. These are a lot of times smaller churches that don't necessarily have a board. They have a local leadership team, but the board of those churches is our district officials and leadership. So it may be a couple of our state reps or our state pastors with regional pastors that form the board with the pastor. And these district affiliated churches, a lot of times the way the pastor is brought on by the selection of the district or the network. It's not voted on by the people of the church. So the goal should be, with every district affiliated church, that it does become a general council church in the Assemblies of God and be able to function on its own. Usually a district affiliated church is under district leadership because it just can't function fully as its own entity. And that's where the Assemblies of God is just a little bit different. Most denominations, it's either the churches are heavy board run. And I will say that we have Assemblies of God churches where the board is heavy and making decisions and that kind of thing. But yeah, and I found this even in serving on a few organization boards, that sometimes boards just don't have the proper training. What's their role? I'd be curious how many board members that serve on a board of organizations and so forth understand the legal liability they have by serving on a board. And so it's one of those. I just don't think in America that we educate our boards really what the function of the boards serve as. But that's the responsibility of the pastor to help bring that training.
Yeah. So how would a pastor kind of deal with the individual personalities of said board, work with them, because some boards, quite frankly, are really good, and then some, like you kind of shared in your testimony, are really terrible. And you didn't go too deeply into why, even though I know why. But so how does a pastor deal with it?
Yeah. Here's the we're all human, right? So, and I would say sometimes pastors are selfish, and sometimes board members are selfish. They'll make decisions of what their wants are, not necessarily what is good for the majority. And so I don't know, for me as a pastor, I would hope I would have people that would serve on my board that would have pushback, um, and would be okay of disagreeing with me. But when it comes down to it, I would hope that I would have that same respect back with the board and understand that they're there, served for a purpose, and it's to keep me accountable. But in the same respect, I would hope the board would also understand that I'm there as a spiritual leader, and there is a unique mantle that is given to spiritual leaders of churches where they see things that nobody else sees. And discernment of understanding, maybe I would even say struggles that people go through. That no, yeah, there's just it's a unique mantle. And so hopefully there's a relationship where that is formed. There are some pastors that end up shaping a board that will only say yes, which is a scary, scary place because then there is no accountability. And then sometimes the board will overthrow. Yeah, they just don't like the spiritual leader. They want their agenda, and so there has to be a give and take, and there has to be trust, and there has to be faith. And yeah, it has to be a working relationship, but it's an understanding that for a board member, it's not their church, and for a pastor, it's not their church. It's God's church. It's God's church, and the decisions that are being made, um, you may not like the decision, whether as a pastor or as a board member or both. But if it's the right decision, because that's what God wants, then it's the right decision. And yeah, it's just it's a weird relationship and a weird balance of having politics within a spiritual place. You think that doesn't it shouldn't is like oil and water, but yet there has to be a balance in that.
Yeah. How do you gain trust with the board or with the congregation when you're talking about the vision of the church?
Action, right? So, it takes time. My situation, uh, here, I didn't have a long enough time for them to know who I am. And, so the board just wanted to make a quick decision, and it felt like they needed to make a decision. Honestly, I mean, it's my situation where I'm at down in Southern Oregon. I could have forced a vote and all that stuff, but my heart's desire is never to split a church, and so, and it wouldn't have been good for family to continue to fight politics.
Well,
So, for me, I'm about just building the kingdom and doing that with my family. And I will fight the enemy for my family first and foremost. And so that's what I did. So it takes time. It takes time for people to understand, okay, I could trust the spiritual leader. They've made decisions. They've walked with me through some tough times. And honestly, I think for me, that's where you earn the right to be a spiritual leader of someone's life, is when you have the patience and you're willing to walk someone through some dark times in their life and not be in a place of judgment, and you don't earn the right to be a pastor because you were elected to be a pastor or because you preach a message on a Sunday morning to a congregation. People who I call pastor in my life have earned it. And it's because they have walked with me through some tough times, and I've leaned in on their wisdom. And so, I think that's where people are willing to jump off a cliff with you on a vision when you've earned the right for them to trust you with their life. And that's kind of, I guess, a good example. My friend who recently passed, I spent almost every day in his ICU room. He didn't go to church. I'm not a pastor of a church, but within a couple of weeks, he was introducing me to the people in the ICU room as his pastor. And to me, that I earned it because I was walking through the valley with them. I wasn't preaching from the mountaintop to them.
Right. And shall I say, you earned it with me. So, you talked about your family and how you want to fight for your family, and I want to move from pastorship into your personal with this question, and maybe some ministerial questions, just general ministerial questions, and then we'll call it. You talk about fighting for your family in the previous question. How do you find time for yourself, for your own spiritual growth, but also for your family?
Yeah, I've learned. I mean, I'm in the middle. We're getting ready to be in the middle of basketball season, which I officiate basketball. So there will be days that I will be gone from, because I'm in an elementary school right now in special education. That I'll leave the house at 6:30 in the morning before my daughter wakes up. My wife just is getting up, and I won't get home till 11 o'clock at night. And so it's finding the time that I have that downtime. I'm spending time with them. Now for my spiritual growth, I do that when I first wake up. The very first thing I do is I do my devotions. In my quiet time, when I get ready, I'm either listening to worship music or I've put on a online sermon that, just watching a few churches that I've been watching on live stream. So I just constantly, and then I have my John Maxwell books. We have our Zoom group, which I'm going to plug. I think in January we're going to go through John Maxwell, Jesus, a High Road Leader. So Zoom group, just kind of pouring into each other's life and just faith journey.
It's good. So yeah.
So that's the time. Just family to me has always been number one. And there's times that ministry and other people's situations will interrupt family time, but you make the time, and you make that time that you have with your family special. I learned that as a missionary. When I was on the road, I would be on the road sometimes 2 weeks in a row. And if I knew that I was going to miss like my son's baseball game or something like that, before I got on the road, I would go to a practice. It's those things you or I would drive all night long to get to a game, and surprise my son at a game, and like my daughter's getting ready to play her first year of high school basketball. There will be nights that I will purposely block and not officiate so I could go watch her play JV girls basketball, you know, and you just kind of you make those moments, There's times like in my class, I have kids that climb on me and hug me. They're special needs, and so I get that all day long. And there's times that I walk up to my daughter and I stand in front of her and she knows, oh, daddy needs a hug from me, and it's like I get hugged all day long from other kids. I want a hug from my little girl. And I just make her feel special, and you got to make those moments because kids grow up way too fast.
So, is there anything else you would like to say? Because I think this is a perfect place to end it.
Yeah. I don't think I have really anything else. Michael, I just appreciate you and the questions, and I just my heart's desire for people that and for churches that we keep things kingdom minded. We definitely are living in a time that people's opinions are very high, and very, very divided. And we have a generation that is hungry for truth and wants nothing but truth. And they're just not seeing it. They're not seeing it. And when I say this, I'm not talking just church leadership. They're looking for pure leadership. So why can't we as believers be the one that sets the example of what that looks like? And that's why I love John Maxwell's book, High Road Leadership, and then his follow-up with Jesus is the High Road. Because he is the perfect example of how to bring two sides that are so divided and to be able to have a conversation, but also love the unlovable. And we have to get to a place of believers not looking at other people saying it's those people, or God created them, died for them. And if we're created in his image, there's a part of God's character in them that nobody else, there's a part of God's image that is created in every single person that is unique and different. So why can't we just love people, and just love them to the kingdom?
I like that. And yeah.
Alexa, order AA batteries or reorder paper towels.
I don't know if I can edit that out, but I'll try.
All right. I wouldn't worry about editing that.
I guess since you screwed that up, I'll ask one more question.
Alexa just wanted to join.
What do you think is the struggle for every pastor? And I'll kind of just say, what would be your advice? What's the struggle for the everyday pastor, do you think, in our time? But also, I'll combine it with another question on the list. What advice would you give to new pastors how to do their job well?
Yeah, struggle for everyday pastor. I would say burnout. And the struggle with that, I think pastors, they don't do enough self-care. They probably don't feel comfortable enough letting other people handle responsibilities within the church, which then creates, or the church doesn't allow them to leave or take time off. There's two factors in there, and so it creates the burnout, which then creates ministries and churches that are just getting by, and they're just maintaining, and that's going to end up creating a ministry in a church that isn't producing anything. So yeah, we definitely are living in a time that people want change. They want to see change, and if they're seeing something that's just maintaining or something that's just being repeated or is old, they're not going to stick around. They're going to either vote by leaving or other ways. For pastors, everyday struggle, I would say, is burnout, and part of it is they're just trying to please everybody. So pastors need to be careful with that. What was the second question? It was
what advice would you give to new pastors in their 20s or 30s, whether they're youth or head pastors? What advice would you just generally give?
Yeah, here's the hard part for young pastors, because I would even say I struggle with it, but I think I'm better with it because of what I've walked through the last couple of years. When I get into a church to pastor, I just want to pastor that church. The struggle with young pastors, and I think it's just being young. It's not necessarily pastors, it's just being young. You're so forward thinking that you miss out what's right in front of you. And so they're all maybe looking for, this is my season for now, but why not let that be the season for the next 30, 40 years? Not the next 2 or 3 years and figure out what's that next big ministry or that next step. Maybe there doesn't have to be another step, and that's I would say for young pastors is don't try to bring another church into your ministry. Just be obedient with who you are and what your niche is and your gifting and God has created you to be, and work around that. It goes back to when I was in college, Brownsville revival, right? Everybody wanted to bring the revival back to their church. There are some ministries that want to bring Bethel Redding to their church and try to mimic everything. Just the Holy Spirit's going to move. God's going to move. But let it be unique and different for that community, for that church, and for those people. And don't change the DNA. Don't change the DNA. Don't walk into a place and change the DNA of why people call that their church. It's make sure when you step into a place that your personality, your DNA can merge with that culture and that DNA.
Right.
And you are like-minded. Because if not, it won't work.
Thank you, Pastor, for this runs a little longer than what it normally would, but I wanted to do a real deep dive, and thank you for taking nearly 2 hours out of your schedule. I know it's nearly Thanksgiving, so you've had the time, but thank you.
Yeah. Yeah. No, thank you for doing this, and thanks for having me again.
Well, see you, everyone, and I hope that every single one of you has a great Thanksgiving. See you soon.